Alright, here's the problem with Neovim, okay? You never are done configuring. That is the problem. I hate it. I hate it. I'm never done configuring. It's been so long, and I wanted to make this video months ago, and it's like I cannot stop configuring. It's actually a problem, but it's finally time. I'm gonna go over Neovim. I'm gonna go over my configuration, and I also made some blueprints for how you can get started on your own configuration if you've never touched Neovim before, or if you just want to take my configuration and expand upon it, personalize it, make it into your own. So I will put links for absolutely everything in the description, so I'm not going to say that I'm going to put a link for it every single time I reference something, because it's all going to be there. You can go ahead, pick up my configuration, slap it into config and vim, and when you boot up Neovim for the first time, you should actually get a screen that looks something like this. If you don't get this, just run plug install, and it should automatically use vim plug and install all the plugins. So if you get a bunch of errors, just run plug install, restart Neovim, and then you should be good to go from there. And my main configuration file is under init.lua here, but that actually brings me to talking about this little guide that I made here, because the first thing to pick when it comes to Neovim configuration is what sort of configuration are you actually looking for, right? You have minimal on one end of the spectrum, and you have a full IDE on the other end of the spectrum. And you can go from, having 5 plugins, super minimal configuration, all the way to, 45 plugins, a full IDE level configuration. And I would say my configuration is somewhere between minimal and power user. And I've actually included in this guide here, I will probably stick this in as like a README file in the directory. I've included some plugin suggestions for like each level of configuration, and a possible directory structure you could go for, but everything here is super malleable. Don't worry about making the right choices when it comes to configuration. You can always change absolutely everything later. You can change absolutely everything about my configuration. You can, make a choice early on in terms of directory structure and change it completely later on, so don't worry about making the right choices up front. But once you sort of have an idea of what sort of configuration you're going for, the next thing to do is choose your initial directory structure. If you're already super comfortable with Vim script, I would just go with init.vim. No reason not to use it if you already know it and love it. But if you don't know Vim script, I would just go with init.lua then. I'm personally doing everything in Lua, so I've got my init.lua, and then I've also got a Lua directory here. And under that Lua directory, I've got a config directory with all of the main configuration stuff. So autocmds, mappings, and actually I should mention, if you want to go change mappings, it's just this mapping.lua file. I'm actually not going to explain mappings at all, since you can either just go read them or change them if you wish. And I do have a witch key, so you can pull up the mappings quickly if you needed to. Options here, and then a theme, and I'll get to this theme since that's a fun one later. And plugins is all of my plugin configuration. So the deal with how my directory structure works, it's taking, from this init.lua as the main file, and it's actually using this require section to split everything into alternate files. And you have choice if you want to do this in your configuration or not. I could, get rid of all these alternate files and stick it all into this main init.lua. It's just it would then be, 1,000 lines long and very messy. So it's usually easier to split up your configuration into separate directories and files, so that way it keeps it organized. But that's just going to depend on, how minimal you're going, how many plugins you're planning to install. If you're going to install, 10 different plugins, you probably want to start splitting up your configuration to different files. But I did include, some example directory structures if you just want to get some ideas for how you might want to set up your configuration. And just make sure you're calling your other files correctly. So if you're using Lua, this would be how you would call your other files there. And once you've decided on an initial directory structure, and to be clear, you could always start with, a singular init.lua, and then once you get more plugins, you can eventually, split into more files. So don't feel locked into one thing or another. Once you've chosen a directory structure to start with, you can go ahead and pick your plugin manager. So I'm using Vim plug, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video. It's minimal, it does its job, it does it well. I personally really like it, but if you don't like it, there's plenty of other options available. And that actually brings me to talking about this list here. This is probably the most helpful list in existence when it comes to Neovim plugins. It's essentially just a huge mega list with plugins organized into categories here. And when you click on a category, you're going to get, a list of plugins, and then, short description. You can go look at the links for them. So if you want to see some other plugin managers, here are links for them. This is the page for Vim plug, the one I'm using, and every plugin manager is going to have installation instructions, so just follow along with the instructions. It should get everything installed. And just for calling your plugins, make sure you're following the correct instructions for your plugin manager in order to call your plugins. I did want to point out Lazy Nvim since I've used this before. It's a much more fully featured plugin manager. It's got, a lock file, all sorts of other stuff. It's got this fancy looking UI here. So if you want something a little bit more fancy and feature rich, this is a good option. But, like I said, there's plenty of other plugin managers if you don't like any of those. So once you've picked what you want, you've gotten the basic setup done, it is time to call your plugins. And this is the fun part because you have a lot of choice here. There's literally thousands of Neovim plugins. So if you're really new to Neovim, you're just super overwhelmed by all of the choice. That is why I made this sort of structured list of what sorts of plugins you might want depending on the configuration you're looking for. Obviously, this is in no way a hard and fast list, but this hopefully, if you're really struggling and not sure what you might want when you have, a list that's literally got thousands of plugins, this should, hopefully point you in the right direction and get you started at least. But in terms of my own plugins, so I've got two color scheme plugins, first of all. Cat Puchin is the main color scheme that you always see me use. I usually use it because I like the brighter colors in Neovim, but I do actually have a quick toggle set up to turn on Pywall 16 colors, so just pulling from the wallpaper since I have Pywall installed. So if you do have Pywall installed and functional, you should be able to just go ahead and toggle. I've got it bound to leader P to toggle it, but you could change the binding, of course, if you wanted to. The only reason I don't use Pywall constantly is because it's pretty dark and I usually prefer, brighter colors. Next up, I'm using Lualine for the status line at the bottom here. Lualine is organized into an ABC XYZ formatting. It's pretty simple to configure. It's pretty easy to add in what you want, and it has a bunch of different default options. But if you don't like Lualine, there's plenty of other status bar plugins available. Just go to status line here and you've got, 20 options here. So you could really pick whatever you wanted, and that goes for every plugin. If you don't like any plugins that I have, you could just get rid of them, pick something else. And I also did try to add in comments explaining, briefly what every plugin is doing. So if you're, for example, not using Pywall, you want to just immediately get rid of this, you could just go ahead and nuke this. Anyways, dev icons. So this actually brings me to a pretty important point regarding plugins. When you're installing plugins, sometimes plugins will require other plugins. It'll mention it, so just make sure you're installing any requirements as needed. I mentioned that with dev icons here, since I'm pretty sure Lualine has an optional requirement for dev icons. I think I have something else here that also has a requirement for dev icons. That's just, for the little icons here. Next up, which key is just for this helpful little mappings pop-up because I forget my bindings as much as everybody else does. Bar, so I'm using that for the buffer line, and there's a lot of different plugins available to configure buffer line, but just to give you a quick little demonstration, bar is nice. It just, you can move stuff around, you can pin, unpin. I like it. It's got a lot of configuration and customization available if you choose to use it. If you don't like it, plenty of other tab line plugins that are available. I'm using Alpha for the little startup menu, so if I go and restart Neovim here, this is Alpha. It's got a header section, it's got a footer section, and then it's got hotkeys bound to commands here. And you could, of course, change all the configuration on this menu if you wanted to. You could even change the theme. Alpha has a few different themes available. But if you don't like this menu, plenty of other startup plugins available, or you could just not even have a startup plugin. Tree sitter. So this one I would recommend to pretty much everybody, no matter how minimal you're going. It's just for improved syntax highlighting. It just does a better job than Neovim does natively. So I would just highly recommend this to pretty much anybody. Next up, I'm using Nvim lint for essentially just diagnostics on files. So if I go ahead, type some junk in here that obviously doesn't belong in a Lua file, I try to write this, it's going to go ahead, give me a that's not good, don't do that there, and then if I write again, it'll fix it. So I just want that really basic linting on files, and only for some file types. But this is the sort of thing where if you're looking to expand my configuration, you might want to get, a full-on LSP, auto-completion, all sorts of different stuff for, far better diagnostics, definitions, all sorts of different stuff. But I'm just using Nvim lint here. It's relatively minimal, and I just want, basic, like it's gonna let me know if I really mess up a file. Next up for File Explorer, I'm using Nvim tree. It is classic, it does its job, I like it. I did want to point out though, another plugin for File Explorer that I've used in the past is Triptych. If you've ever used Ranger as a file explorer, you might be familiar with this sort of a layout, and I did use Ranger in the past, and I really like this layout. The only thing with Neovim is it's easier to kind of have, you know, this little sidebar tree here. So that's the only reason I switched back to NVim tree, just so I could, you know, keep it on sidebar rather than having a huge pop-up filling the screen. But there's plenty of other file explorer plugins available if you wanted something else. Next up, auto pairs. Auto pairs, pretty much what you would expect, you know, auto pairing parentheses, comments, etc. Git signs, just some indicators for Git. Comments, just better, easier commenting. Color highlighting, it'll just highlight a hex code, for example, with a color. It'll also do RGB codes. I actually have, sometimes, you know, you could enable it to just highlight like the name of a color there. I have that disabled, but you could go into the configuration, enable that if you wanted to. Next up, FCF Lua. So I'm using the good old classic FCF here, well, the FCF Lua implementation, that is. And this is just, you know, FCF. Everybody knows FCF, everybody loves FCF. There's a bunch of other fuzzy finders available, though. If you wanted something a little bit more extensible, I've used Telescope here before. It's very extensible, got some more features. You could check that out, or you could go back to this, you know, awesome Neovim list here and look through the various fuzzy finders available. There's plenty. But FCF Lua does have some really nice features. So for example, you could grep over a word. I just have that set up with a binding, so I can grep the word grep there if I wanted to, or I could just, you know, pull up a normal grep menu and, you know, enter a word if I wanted to. You can also set Fuzzy Finder to execute in specific directories, which is really helpful because by default, I've just got it executing in the directory that I launched Neovim in. But I also have some bindings set up to fuzzy find, particularly in config or in local src, etc. Since it's kind of a waste to try to fuzzy find over your entire home directory when you could be fuzzy finding in the correct directory. If you already know something's going to be in config, like just look there, right? Without having to fuzzy find over your entire home directory. Then I've got fterm. That's just for a quick little floating terminal. I like the floating terminal look actually, but there's plenty of other terminal plugins if you prefer a windowed terminal, etc. So those are the plugins I'm using. And of course the plugin configuration, all just in here. You could go through, edit these. It's worth mentioning with plugins, you don't necessarily have to configure them. A lot of the time plugins will have pretty sensible defaults and you can just go with the defaults, or if you want to turn on an option here or there, like for example with NVim tree, right? These are obviously not all of the options available. I could even set up, you know, all of the bindings with NVim tree if I wanted to, and instead I'm just using the defaults, and I'm also using the defaults for every option that isn't copied in here. But you can just, with plugins, set up what you want and leave what you're okay with in terms of defaults. It is actually worth mentioning, now that I've got this file open, just a note on the icons. I commented this in here, since some patched fonts will actually cut off glyphs in the sidebar in the tree. So if I had glyphs enabled, they would be slightly cut off. That just seems to depend on the font. I did a bit of testing with this. I tried like 10 different fonts. The particular font I'm using right now is the only font with this issue out of those 10 fonts. I don't know why it's like that, but yeah, I've just got icons disabled for that reason. So if you wanted to enable them and your font is fine and supports them just fine, you could go ahead and enable them here. Interesting. I'm not sure why it does that. If anybody knows why that's the case, let me know. Interesting little bug there. But anyways, so back to plugin configuration. I already mentioned this is just moving everything into its separate config files. And then the last thing in my init.lua here is actually this global function. So if I go over here and pull up this theme.lua, I've got a couple functions here. This is for toggling the themes, like I said, and this is kind of funny because honestly, I should just be using a plugin for this. There are literally plugins for this exact purpose that would probably accomplish this far better. But no, instead I'm just using a couple functions here to switch the theme on command and then save the theme names to a file. And it's actually saving two names here. The reason for that is LuaLine, for some reason, has a different name for some themes. So the main color scheme theme here for Pywall is just Pywall16. But the LuaLine version is Pywall16-NVim. I don't know why it's like that, but it seems to be like that. So it's saving both names. If you want to add in more themes, if you've installed, you know, plugins for other themes, you can go ahead, add them in here. Just beware, sometimes the LuaLine name seems to be different. And then it just will cycle through the themes you have and enable them and then save them, so it should be persistent across restart. Next up, in terms of files here, so I've got my auto command file, essentially just useful little auto commands. You could comment anything out if you don't want it. I have tried to, add in comments mentioning what everything does. So for example, this is, linting when the file is written to. When the file is write, how about written to? Yeah, no. So for example, if I, do a bunch of stuff that doesn't belong and I write, that's going to lint when the file is written to there. I don't know why it said write. I must be tired. Anyways, so some other useful commands here, like spell check in Markdown, disabling automatic comments on new line, highlighting text on yank. I actually commented reloading files on external chains because that actually, I don't really like that, but you could uncomment that if you wanted to. Restore cursor position on file open if you want that. Yeah, so just useful auto commands. You could, get rid of anything if you don't like it. Comment anything out, add anything in. Next up, mapping. So I have tried to add comments as much as possible for anything that wasn't obvious. But of course, I would highly encourage go remap everything to whatever bindings you're already used to. Don't try to learn my bindings, just remap to your bindings. I always like to remap as much as possible, so that way I can have, one set of bindings memorized and not have to learn 5 different sets of bindings for 5 different programs, So easier to just take a few minutes, remap everything to what you're already used to. I've got a couple of functions at the bottom here just for some basic stuff, like for example, toggling relative line numbers if needed. And then in my options.lua file here, so this is, if you've never configured Neovim before, I would highly recommend just pull up the options and just view through all the options, figure out what you want. It is worth the time to, read through and, figure out what you actually want in terms of options. I think I also put in my guide here a link if it's easier for you to just browse it in browser and you want to just read through there, you could do that. If you're really not sure what options to go for, you could just take mine or somebody else's, copy it in, and then change stuff as needed. I did try to add in some comments explaining what stuff does for anything that, wasn't super obvious what it does, but options are always going to depend on what you personally want. So it does, make sense to take the time and go through and see what options are available, because I always found, for a while I hadn't configured options a ton. And then I realized later on, things that were annoying me were just option settings that I could toggle on and off. So it really is worth going through and configuring your options. At the end here, this is just turning off diagnostic signs that would appear, in line if needed. I have that toggled off. You could toggle it back on if you wanted them. For some reason, that just annoys me though, so I have it toggled off. And I think that's pretty much all of the files to go through for my configuration. Obviously, I've got all the plugin files. I haven't, gone through in depth every single plugin configuration, but I have tried to add comments everywhere, so you should be able to figure it out if needed. And of course, the main thing, I guess, missing from this configuration is LSP and autocompletion and all sorts of, IDE level features that if you're doing more intense development, you might want. Obviously, I don't really do a ton of development. I just kind of work on my own stuff personally, and then I do my, little configuration stuff here. So you might want, more of an IDE level setup. And if so, I did add in some, plugin suggestions for example, if you want, refactoring and debugging and, code building and running, etc. Or you might want to look through even this power user menu has some stuff that I don't have. So, LSP autocompletion, snippets, better Git integration. You might want project and session management, etc. But these guides should hopefully get you started if you've never configured Neovim. If you're really not sure where to start, I would say, take my configuration or somebody else's configuration and just try to build off of that until you're more comfortable with it, and then you can go ahead and start on your own. You can always change stuff later on. Don't worry about making the right choices up front. But anyways, have fun configuring Neovim. I'll see you next time. Peace!